If they had paid attention, they would have seen it. If they had listened, they would have heard the warnings. If only they knew what lived under their roof. Michael and Angela had everything. Wealth. Status. A home that could fit 10 families. A love story others envied. And in the heart of it all, a newborn son, Daniel. Their lives moved fast. Too many meetings. Too many late nights. And so, when Madame Grace arrived, they barely noticed how easily she became part of their world. She was the perfect nanny. Quiet. Obedient. Watchful. Daniel never cried in her arms. Never fussed. Never turned away. But if they had looked closer, they would have seen the way he stared past her face. Past the walls. As if something else, something unseen, was holding him instead. The days passed, and Daniel changed. His cries grew softer, his body lighter, his skin colder. A child once full of life now lay still in his crib, eyes open but distant, as if looking beyond the room, beyond the world his parents knew. Angela noticed first. How his tiny fingers no longer curled around hers. How his breath, once steady and strong, now came in shallow whispers. She called Michael. He shrugged it off. Babies fall ill, he told her. But Angela was a mother. And a mother knows when something is wrong. She brought him to the doctor. They ran tests, checked his lungs, his heart, his blood. Nothing explained the weakness in his limbs, the strange rashes blooming across his soft skin, the hollow look in his eyes. The medicines did nothing. The baby's body refused to heal. Yet in the hands of Madame Grace, he was calm. He did not cry. He did not struggle. He only stared, wide-eyed, mouth slightly open, as if in silent conversation with something unseen. The housemaid was the first to say it aloud. She had seen Madame Grace, leaning close, lips moving, whispering into the baby's ear. But when she told Angela, the words felt foolish in her mouth. Who would believe such things in a house of wealth and science? Who would believe that an old woman, gentle in her ways, could hold darkness behind her eyes? That night, Angela lay awake, ears tuned to every sound. And then, it came. A low murmur, rolling through the air like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. A language she did not know. A voice that did not sound human. It came from the nursery. She rushed inside. Madame Grace sat in the rocking chair, Daniel in her arms. The baby's face was blank, expressionless. The old woman's lips were still. She said nothing. But Angela could feel it, an emptiness, a quiet that did not belong. Madame Grace smiled, slow and knowing. Angela shivered. But she said nothing. Did nothing. She turned and walked away, whispering to herself that exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. She did not see the baby's eyes flicker toward the ceiling. Did not see the way his tiny lips parted, as if listening. As if something above him had begun to speak. The house began to change. It was not the walls, nor the floors, nor the grand chandeliers that once bathed their home in golden light. No. The change was unseen, creeping into the spaces between words, settling into the silences that stretched too long, too deep. Michael and Angela no longer sat close. Their laughter, once bright and easy, became short, forced, unfamiliar. Small things became big things. A misplaced key. A forgotten message. The meal left cold on the table. Michael snapped, his words sharp, cutting deeper than he intended. Angela turned away, her shoulders heavy with a weight she could not name. Her thoughts tangled. Her mind, once sharp and clear, slipped like sand between her fingers. Where had she placed the baby's butter? Had she fed him today? Had she bathed him? She would stand in the nursery, staring at her own hands, unable to remember what they had just done. Michael accused her of being careless. Angela accused him of being absent. The warmth between them faded, replaced by something else. Something cold. Something that washed. Through it all, Daniel barely made a sound. His little body lay still, his face blank, his eyes open longer than they should be. The only time he seemed at peace was when Madame Grace held him, her voice rising in a slow, haunting melody. A lullaby neither Michael nor Angela had ever heard before. The tune wrapped around the walls, weaving through the air like a thread pulled through cloth, tightening, tightening. Angela tried to hum it later, but the notes escaped her, slipping from memory like a dream upon waking. One night, Michael stood at the door, watching. Madame Grace roped Daniel, her voice low, her fingers running lightly over his forehead. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. A heaviness pressed against his chest. His limbs felt stiff, unwilling to move. He blinked, and for the briefest moment, the shadows around Madame Grace seemed wrong. Too long. Too dark. Moving when nothing else did. Then she looked at him. Smiled. And the moment passed. Michael turned away, rubbing his eyes. It was exhaustion, he told himself. Just exhaustion. In their bed that night, Angela reached for him. Michael turned his back. The space between them had never felt wider. The night the old woman knocked, the wind carried a strange weight. It whispered through the trees, rattled the windows, pressed against the doors as if urging them shut. But the knock came again, firm, deliberate, waiting. Angela opened the door and found Mama Ijeoma standing there, wrapped in a faded wrapper, her head scarf tight, her eyes sharp and knowing. She was older than time itself, it seemed, her face carved with the lines of many years, her voice steady as a river that had seen too much. Angela welcomed her in, offered her water, but the old woman did not sit. Did not drink. She only stood, her back straight, her gaze heavy with things unsaid. I have seen this before, she finally spoke, and the air in the room seemed to still. That woman is not who you think she is. Angela's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The words were strange. Uncomfortable. They did not belong in the world she had built, in the house she had designed with care, in the life she had shaped with love and hard work. Madame Grace was just a nanny. Just an old woman helping with her child. Nothing more. Nothing less. Mama Ijeoma did not blink. Did not move. Watch your child closely, she said, her voice low, warning. You are not the first to hire her, but you may be the last. Angela's heart stammered, but she forced a smile, forced laughter into a throat that had suddenly gone dry. It's just the stress, she told herself later, long after Mama Ijeoma had left. Just the exhaustion. Just the worries of an old woman who saw ghosts where there were none. She closed the door. Locked it. Moved on. But that night, long after Michael had turned away from her in bed, long after the lights had been shut, Angela lay awake. She listened to the soft shuffle of feet down the hall. To the faint hum of a lullaby that did not belong to her. To the slow creak of the rocking chair, back and forth, back and forth. She told herself it was nothing. That there was no reason to be afraid. But deep inside, something had already begun to stir. The night carried no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant call of an owl. Only silence. A silence too thick, too heavy, pressing against the walls like something alive. Then, the whispering began. Angela's eyes snapped open. A voice, low, steady, speaking in a tongue she did not know. The words coiled in the air, calling under doors, slipping through cracks, wrapping themselves around her ears. She sat up, heart pounding, the darkness around her feeling deeper than it had ever been. She turned toward Michael, but he lay still, his breath slow, unmoving, as if locked in a sleep too deep to be touched. The whispering did not stop. It called to her, pulled at something within her. And so, barefoot and trembling, she followed. Down the hallway, past the cold stretch of walls that seemed to grow longer with each step. The whispering led her to the nursery. The door stood slightly open. Candlelight flickered inside. Angela peered in, and froze. Madame Grace stood over the crib, her shadow stretching across the floor, her hands hovering above the baby's small, fragile body. In her grip was something black, something old, something pulsing as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. Angela's chest tightened. Her skin crawled. She opened her mouth. A scream tore from her throat. But Madame Grace did not flinch. Did not stutter. She only turned, slow and deliberate, her face calm. A smile stretched across her lips, not wide, not forced, but knowing. Too knowing. Then, she was gone. Not a step was taken. Not a door creaked. One moment she was there, the next, only empty space remained where she had stood. Angela staggered forward, hands gripping the crib. Daniel lay still, untouched, eyes closed. He was asleep. But the room still felt wrong. It felt washed. Morning came, but sleep never did. Angela waited for the sun to rise, waited for the light to banish the shadows that clung to the corners of her home. And when it did, she went where she had never dared to go before. Madame Grace's room was small. Simple. A single bed, a wooden trunk, a table pressed against the wall. But something was off. The air smelled strange, of earth, of something damp, something rotting just beneath the surface. Angela moved slowly, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid of the trunk. Bundles of cloth sat inside. Small. Folded neatly. She reached in, pulled one out, and unwrapped it. Tiny clothes. Baby clothes. Not Daniel's. Not any she had ever seen before. She grabbed another. And another. Dozens of them. Some new. Some old, the fabric worn thin by time. The air in the room grew heavier, as if something unseen was pressing in, waiting, watching. On the table, a bowl sat still. The water inside was dark, black as night, too deep for something so small. Angela leaned forward. Looked in. A reflection stared back at her, but it was not her own. Daniel's face floated in the water. But his eyes were open. He was smiling. A slow, airy smile. Yet when Angela turned to the crib, where he lay sleeping, his mouth was slack, his breath steady. He was not awake. He was not smiling. Her hands shook. Her breath hitched. And then she saw it. A wooden doll, no bigger than her palm, resting at the foot of the bed. It was bound in red cloth, its limbs stiff, lifeless. But its hair. Angela reached down, her fingers brushing against the strands woven into the wood. She knew this hair. Knew the texture. The scent. It was hers. And Michael's. Her chest tightened. Her pulse roared in her ears. Something inside her screamed to run. To leave. But her feet remained planted, her body frozen in place. Because in that moment, she understood. Madame Grace had not entered their home. She had claimed it. And she had started with their son. Angela's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her hands still trembled from what she had seen. The bowl. The doll. The hair woven into its tiny, wooden frame. The black water that held a reflection that did not belong to this world. She had not dreamed it. She had not imagined it. It was real. All of it. She turned to Michael, desperation clinging to every word, but he only frowned, shaking his head. The weight of exhaustion hung in his voice. The sharpness of disbelief lay thick between them. He told her she was tired. Stressed. That she needed rest. But Angela saw it then, he was not himself. His eyes had lost their warmth. His hands, once gentle, felt colder now. As if something had drained him without him even knowing. And then, the baby cried. It was not the small, whimpering sound of hunger. Not the tired wail of a restless child. No. This cry was different. Piercing. Wild. A sound that did not belong to an infant. It rattled through the walls, seeped into the floors, called into the very bones of the house. Angela ran before Michael could stop her, her feet pounding against the cold tiles, heart slamming against her ribs. The nursery door stood wide open. The crib, empty. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadow stretched across the room, dark and unmoving. Slowly, her gaze lifted. Madame Grace stood in the far corner, the baby cradled in her arms, swaying side to side, humming low and deep. The melody sent a shiver through the air. It was ancient. Older than the walls of the house. Older than Angela's grandmother. Older than the trees that lined the village where her ancestors once walked. The words were not meant for human ears, yet they filled the space, wrapping around the room like an unseen force. Angela did not think. Did not hesitate. She lunged. But the moment her hands reached out, the old woman changed. Her back straightened. Her shoulders stretched unnaturally. Her frame, once small and frail, lengthened until she loomed over Angela like a shadow against the night. Her bones cracked as her body twisted into something too tall, too thin, her fingers stretching, curling, bending where no joints should bend. Her eyes, black as the deepest part of the river, locked onto Angela's, void of warmth, void of mercy. Angela stumbled back, her throat tightening, her pulse roaring. Her limbs would not move. Her breath would not come. And then, the woman spoke. You never should have looked, child. Now you know too much. A sudden gust filled the room, yet the windows were closed. The air thickened, a scent of earth and decay filling Angela's nostrils. Madame Grace lifted her hand, releasing a fine, grey powder into the air. The moment it touched Angela's skin, her body failed her. Her knees buckled. The world tilted. And then, nothing. Michael woke to silence. Angela lay beside him, her body still, her skin cold. Panic surged through him as he shook her, called her name. No response. A thin layer of dust clung to her face, the fine powder settling into the folds of her skin. He wiped at it frantically, his hands shaking. And then, through the silence, he heard it. The absence of sound where there should have been breath. The empty space where there should have been life. The nursery. The baby. He ran, heart pounding, fear rising like bile in his throat. The crib was empty. The sheets untouched. The room smelled wrong, damp, stale, as if it had been abandoned for years. He turned wildly, calling Daniel's name, his voice echoing against walls that suddenly felt too close, too tight. And then, a sound. A rustle, a shift. From the far end of the house, a door stood ajar. Madame Grace's room. Michael stepped inside, his breath shallow. The smell was stronger here. Earth. Smoke. Something deeper, something rotting beneath the floorboards. The dim light flickered against the trunk, the wooden table, the cursed bowl of water still black as the void. And in the center of it all, wrapped in thick black cloth, lay Daniel. His tiny form was still. Too still. Michael rushed forward, pulling the baby into his arms, shaking, calling, pleading. But Daniel did not move. His skin was warm, yet lifeless. His mouth was slack, yet no breath came. And then, a sound. A laugh. Low. Amused. Coming from the darkness that stretched beyond the walls. Madame Grace stood there, watching, her frame shifting at the edges, her mouth curled in a smile that did not belong to a human face. "You let me in," she whispered, the words slithering through the air, thick and poisonous. "You let me take what I needed." The walls around them groaned. The ceiling stretched, the very house bending, twisting, reshaping itself like a living thing. Whispers swarmed the air, voices layered upon voices, old and new, near and far. The very foundation of the home trembled under their weight. Michael clutched the baby tighter, his own breath strangled in his throat. The walls paused, the shadows deepened, and somewhere in the shifting dark, something else began to wake. Angela's eyes fluttered open. The world around her shifted in shadows, thick and unsteady. Her body felt heavy, her limbs cold, her breath shallow. She tried to call for Michael, to call for Daniel, but when she opened her mouth, nothing came. No sound. No whisper. No voice. Her hands flew to her throat, her chest heaving, panic rising like a tide too strong to hold back. She tried again. Nothing. It was as if something had stolen the very words from her tongue, had sealed her voice inside a place where no one could reach. And then, she remembered. The powder. The darkness. The words Madame Grace had spoken before the world faded away. A curse. Michael held Daniel close, his heart a hammer inside his chest. He did not wait. He did not look back. He pulled Angela to her feet, half carrying, half dragging her toward the door. The house groaned around them, as if waking from a deep sleep, as if sensing their departure. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with voices that did not belong to the living. And then, Madame Grace spoke one final time. Her voice did not rise, did not shout. It was soft, steady, and worse than all the horrors before it. Because in her words, there was no anger, no fury, only certainty. "You can run," she murmured, "but the bond is made. You will never be whole again." The words coiled in the air like smoke, sinking into the skin, wrapping themselves around bone. Michael did not stop. He did not breathe. He pushed through the door, out into the night, into the world beyond that house of shadows and secrets. The cool air hit them, but there was no relief. No peace. Because the moment their feet touched the earth outside, the baby screamed. A wail unlike any they had ever heard before. Endless. Unnatural. It scraped against the night, twisting through the trees, into the wind, into the very fabric of existence. Angela flinched, her hands pressing against her ears, her silent lips trembling. Michael held Daniel tighter, whispering, pleading, but the child did not stop. And he never would. The days that followed were long, endless stretches of darkness and madness. The house that had once stood grand and golden, that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, now stood hollow. The walls cracked, the floors creaked under unseen weight. The ceiling sagged as if pressing downward, as if something heavy had settled upon them. The air grew thick with rot, the scent of damp wood and something deeper, something festering in the bones of the home. Angela no longer smiled. No longer spoke. She sat in the dim light of the nursery, rocking in an empty chair, her gaze distant, lost in a place no one could reach. Her hands trembled, clutching at her throat, her breath shallow, her mind slipping further and further into silence. Michael fought. He fought to hold his world together, to keep his business from falling, to keep the house from crumbling, to keep his wife from disappearing into the nothingness that now clung to her. But it was useless. The calls stopped coming. The clients disappeared. The numbers dwindled until there was nothing left to count. He had built his empire with his own 2 hands, but now, no matter how hard he tried, everything slipped through his fingers. And Daniel never stopped crying. Day and night, his wails filled every corner of every room. No food soothed him. No arms calmed him. No doctor could explain the terror that gripped his small, fragile body. His face twisted in agony, his tiny hands clawing at the air, his voice raw, endless. The child who once lay silent in his crib now knew no peace. And neither did his parents. The house stood as a shell, a place where the sun never lingered, where warmth refused to settle. It had been theirs once. But now, it belonged to something else. Something unseen.